Hello YouTube, my name's Cameron and welcome to the forum. This is the first ever episode of this new news show that I would like to start for Canadians that's dedicated to conversation. This is where an intro would usually come in, but I don't have one yet. So let's just get right into the news. Our main story today is the mass amounts of flooding we've seen across the country this past week. And while we've seen provinces like Alberta, British Columbia, and Quebec with flooding, it's New Brunswick that's really taken the most damages. The flooding in New Brunswick, now in its second week, has displaced thousands of residents. More evacuations have been underway since the water is unlikely to recede for at least another 5 days. The initial damage estimate is about $24 million, and that's likely to increase, according to a federal fisheries and oceans official. Water levels in St. John reached a record 5.43 meters on Friday, and they're expected to hit 5.9 meters by Monday, according to the province's 5-day forecast. Officials urge anyone in communities such as Grand Lake, Gemseg, Gagetown, Hampstead, Belle Isle, Oak Point, Grand Bay Westfield, Quispamsis, and St. John to be on high alert. As of Friday, 747 people in 309 households from across the province of New Brunswick had registered with the Red Cross. It's with stories like this that I'm reminded of how lucky we are as Canadians to have a government work so quickly to get people evacuated, as well as organizations such as the Red Cross to make sure people get out and stay safe. While I'm on the topic of flooding in New Brunswick, I want to bring up a man named Maurice Lavigne. Lavigne is a Fredericton resident, and he's been able to keep the St. John River waters out of his house. He's done this with the help of a $15,000 inflatable flood protection system. The device is a portable, self-inflating, reusable water barrier developed 15 years ago by a company in Quebec. From the photos I've seen, the barrier seems to be doing an incredible job at keeping his house dry while his road is completely flooded. The barrier is said to be able to protect the house from up to a meter of water, so we'll see how that's able to hold up as the water levels in New Brunswick continue to rise. I bring this story up because I really like what Lavigne said in an article published by CBC News. Quote, "We have these problems and we seem to just react after the fact. Let's do something now in advance and be proactive. It would be a lot more reassuring for people." End quote. I personally think that if not the government, private sector companies should be investing heavily into these portable water barrier systems. It's something that consumers desperately need, as we're starting to see, and if the water levels around the coasts and rivers keep rising, I think that we should be seeing a rising demand for devices such as these. If you want to read the full articles of this story or any of the stories I talk about, links are going to be in the description down below. In other news, a recent poll published by CBC News shows that, quote, "Albertans aren't as conservative as you might think." Essentially, CBC had 1,200 Albertans answer a questionnaire about their political leanings and their value priorities, followed by a series of focus groups. I'll include the link to the story in the description, like I do with all stories, but the main thing I want to hit on with this is the numbers concerning political leanings. CBC found that 30% of those 1,200 Albertans identified themselves as centrists. This may surprise some, but for me, I expected this kind of number. Centrists are very rarely covered by the media, with the far right and far left getting most of the attention. This can give the illusion that as a society we've become extremely divided. But from what I've found, that's just not the case, as it shows in this poll. Because we have such extreme vocal radicals on either side, I think that many have been driven to think more moderately. And so statistics like this don't surprise me. Even when coming from a province that has been governed by conservatives, excepting last year's election, since 1935. Since I'm on the topic of politics of Alberta, let's talk about the current Premier of Alberta, Rachel Notley. The NDP Premier was elected into office last provincial election in 2015. Since then, CBC has reported that the provincial government security records show that 11 death threats have been made to the Alberta Premier, with even more, quote, "inappropriate contact or communication directed at the provincial government." According to Jason Van Rassel, spokesperson for the Justice and Solicitor General Department, an inappropriate contact or communication is essentially, quote, "overly aggressive or antagonistic," end quote. Threats began in September of 2015 with a tweet and retweet stating, quote, "Really, you dumb cow, "Be careful, woman, or you'll be the first assassination in Alberta." These aggressive public outbursts first surfaced during the Bill 6 debate in the fall of 2015. Bill 6, which is more formally named the Enhanced Protection for Farm and Ranchers' Work Act, sought to bring farm and ranch employees under the Workers' Compensation Act. This made it necessary for farm and ranch owners to register with the Workers' Compensation Board so that all paid workers get mandatory insurance coverage. Also, occupational health and safety standards now apply to farms and ranches. This making employers now responsible for the health and safety conditions of their work environment. Workers could also now refuse work if they felt like they were in imminent danger, and the Occupational Health and Safety Board could now investigate any major injuries or fatalities on ranch and farm sites. This proposed change sparked outrage from critics who thought the bill was an overreach by the government, unnecessary, or simply too intrusive. Going back to the threats to Rachel Notley, while in my opinion they're not representative of the whole of the Alberta constituency, do speak to the lack of approval that Rachel Notley has in her province. As reported by the Edmonton Journal, Notley is sitting at a 33% approval rating. And this is where I'd like to pass my story off to you. Do you feel bad for officials when they get death threats, or do you think that this is just part of the job? Are these threats and inappropriate contacts and communication, are they an indication that officials are not doing their job properly and not representing the populace accurately? Or is the populace misinterpreting policy changes, or is uninformed? Whatever your thoughts are, I'd like to see them in the comments below. Our next story concerns the mess that is Ontario politics. As you may or may not be aware, Kathleen Wynne, the province's Liberal Premier, has the lowest approval rating of all the premiers in the whole country of Canada. Currently, she sits at a whopping 19%, as reported by the Angus Reid Institute. The province of Ontario is having an upcoming election, and Wynne is seeking re-election. Her main opponent being the Progressive Conservative leader, Doug Ford. That name might seem familiar to you, and that's because Doug Ford is the brother of the late Mayor of Toronto, Rob Ford. Without getting too wrapped up in the showmanship that I think characterizes this race so far, I'd like to talk a bit about Doug Ford and Kathleen Wynne. Wynne's critics claim that since getting into office back in 2014, she has not been the change that she presented herself as. Instead, critics suggest that she stands for continuity of the Dalton McGuinty era liberalism that was, quote, characterized by mismanagement, cronyism, and profligate spending. On the other hand, Doug Ford, the new head of the province's Progressive Conservatives, has been deemed Trump-esque in his approach to his campaign and his radical ideas on how Ontario policies should be changed. Now, Ford and Wynne are back in the news this week over a debate on the Greenbelt. This is a lot of exposition, but stick with me. The Greenbelt is an area of 1.8 million acres in southern Ontario that covers agricultural and environmentally sensitive land that stretches from east of Toronto to the shores of the Niagara River. Essentially, the Greenbelt is government-protected lands, which limits the amount of urban development that can occur in those areas. It is, however, a topic of contention among municipal leaders in those areas, as well as land and farm owners in the Greenbelt, who argue that the Greenbelt limits the amount of development that they're able to do and actually encroaches on farmers' rights, among many others. Well, in a flurry of news this week, Ford stated that he would repeal some areas of the Greenbelt to allow urban development to take place. Well, after being met with major backlash and pushback, he then backed off on this. In response to this, Kathleen Wynne then announced that she would, if re-elected, expand the Greenbelt to cover even more land. And I don't really know how to end a story like this, because by this time next week, Ford and Wynne are going to be in another debate over something totally new with even more outlandish exchanges, and I'm going to have to go into even more exposition to cover these topics. But I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the Ontario election thus far? Do you think the description of Ford's campaign as Trump-esque is accurate or biased? What about the disapproval of Wynne? Is it justified or misplaced? As always, leave your thoughts in the comments below and I'll get to them on the weekend show. In federal news, Justin Trudeau is asking for patience from Indigenous leaders and communities as he works on his government's Indigenous rights agenda, saying that it is better done right than done quickly. This announcement came from a special gathering of the Assembly of First Nations on Wednesday, May 2nd. Since February, Trudeau has been working on introducing a legal framework regarding Indigenous rights into the House of Commons. Trudeau has stated that the need for this is, quote, instead of outright recognizing and affirming Indigenous rights, as we promised we would, Indigenous peoples were forced to prove time and time again through costly and drawn-out court challenges that their rights existed, must be recognized, and implemented. End quote. He further stated that a rethinking of Aboriginal rights will allow Indigenous peoples to pursue greater self-determination, with the ultimate goal of addressing entrenched economic and social problems in Indigenous communities. Fast forward to today, and some Indigenous leaders are becoming skeptical of Trudeau's dedication to ensuring the framework gets implemented. In response to this, Trudeau said that he understands the impatience and acknowledges that no group in Canada deserves to be cynical about the government more than Indigenous Canadians. Trudeau says that changes can be done quickly or correctly and that the two are not mutually exclusive. He then went on to restate that his main goal is to make sure that his new nation-to-nation approach is not repealed by future governments. Trudeau attributed the slow approach to his dedication to making sure that every community get what they need, and that it's because that every community has such different needs. Indigenous issues are very divisive in Canada, and I personally feel like this framework that Trudeau wants to implement is a step in the right direction. Indigenous communities are all diverse, so approaching them as one group is detrimental to them all. But again, that's just my opinion. What do you think of Trudeau's proposal? Is Canada getting closer to a resolution with Indigenous groups? Or is this a step back in Indigenous relations to the Government of Canada? Does Trudeau's justification for his slow approach have any merit? Or is it just a politician spouting crap to save his own image? Again, all your thoughts, I want to hear them, whether you agree or disagree with me. Put them in the comments down below, and this weekend, I'll get to them in a response video. And now we look to Quebec, where an anti-capitalist protest for International Workers' Day turned violent minutes after it began on Tuesday in Montreal. More than 200 protesters gathered at La Fontaine Park around 6 p.m. Many, police say, were already in masks. Around 6:30 p.m., protesters began marching toward downtown. Police officers in full riot gear accompanied them. 10 minutes after the march began, fireworks went off and protesters began throwing firecrackers at police, who had to take cover behind parked cars. Police then used chemical irritants to disperse the crowd, and some protesters were arrested by police. The protesters then reconvened near Montreal Station and proceeded onwards to Frontenac Station, without any further incident. Police have stated that they've arrested 5 people for criminal offenses, and 1 person for breaching municipal bylaws in relation to this protest. Now, I personally don't find myself having any sympathy for the protesters arrested. I don't know about freedom of assembly and freedom of speech, but as soon as a speech turns violent action, I feel like you deserve to be punished. By turning a protest into a riot, I think you do nothing to help your own cause, and you also run the risk of imprisonment. And as I do with all my stories, I want to turn it over to you. What are your thoughts on anti-capitalist sentiment? Are they justified in trying to riot? Were the police in the wrong by using chemical irritants? Your thoughts on this story and all the stories I've talked about today? Put them down in the comments below. And that's where I think I'll end today's show. Thank you so much for watching and commenting. I really love your feedback on the show, as this is something I'd like to improve on as it gets better. This is my first ever episode, and I'm looking to turn this into a weekly thing. Remember that this weekend I'll be putting out a weekend show where I look at the comments from this video and I respond to them so we can have an actual dialogue. Because as I said in my opening, this is the Canadian news show that's dedicated to conversation. Like I said, that does it for me. Have a great week, and I hope to see you come back next week.